For centuries, the image of the medieval knight defined European warfare. He was more than just a soldier. He was the living emblem of power, privilege, and divine authority. Clad in layers of glimmering armor, astride a massive warhorse trained for collision and chaos, the knight stood as the embodiment of both military technology and social hierarchy. Battles across Europe, from the Crusades to the internal feuds of noble houses, revolved around the thunderous charge of mounted men. To challenge that image was to challenge the very structure of feudal society itself. Every aspect of chivalric culture reinforced this supremacy: the code of honor, tournaments, heraldry, and religious justification of violence. In the collective mind of the Middle Ages, a knight was not merely powerful, he was invincible. But the illusion of invincibility had cracks hidden beneath the polish of steel. The knight's dominance relied on very specific conditions: open terrain, disciplined cavalry formations, and the psychological shock of a charge that could scatter untrained peasants and militia. The sight of hundreds of armored men galloping in unison was enough to make many armies break before the first impact. Yet, for all its grandeur, the knight's effectiveness depended on the belief that no commoner could ever meet him as an equal. That belief, centuries in the making, would crumble not because of new machines, but because of an old weapon refined by practice: the longbow. In England, archery was not the pastime of nobles, but the duty of commoners. From boyhood, peasants were required by royal decree to practice shooting. Archery ranges became the schools of England's countryside. Over time, the English longbow became more than a weapon, it became a national identity. Standing over 6 feet tall, carved from yew wood, it demanded immense strength to draw, often exceeding 150 pounds of pull. Those who mastered it developed permanent muscle thickening in their shoulders and arms, visible proof of lifelong training. It was the great equalizer. A peasant with a bow could kill a noble with a fortune's worth of armor before he even reached sword's length. And this shift in skill, this mastery of precision over power, was about to shake the very foundations of warfare. By the 14th century, the English crown recognized that its archers were not simply auxiliaries, they were a decisive arm of battle. King Edward III, understanding both the discipline of his longbowmen and the arrogance of continental knights, would orchestrate a moment that redefined military history. It would come during a campaign in northern France, near a small village called Crécy, on a summer-s afternoon in 1346. What happened there would be remembered as the day when the might of centuries, the dominance of the knight, died under a rain of arrows. The summer of 1346 unfolded under tension. Edward III's forces had landed in Normandy, raiding deep into French territory. The English army was smaller, numbering around 14,000 men, but it was organized, disciplined, and guided by a clear tactical vision. Opposing them was the French army under King Philip VI, more than twice their size and fueled by pride. France's nobles viewed the English as invaders and rebels, and they marched with the confidence that sheer weight of cavalry could crush any resistance. The French knights carried generations of reputation behind them. They had fought in tournaments, glorified in songs, and treated the charge as divine ritual. None could imagine that mere archers, commoners with bows, would stop them. When the two armies finally faced each other on August 26, 1346, the English chose their ground wisely. They positioned themselves on a slight ridge near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The terrain sloped downward in front, offering a natural advantage. The English lines were composed of dismounted men-at-arms in the center, flanked by thousands of longbowmen arranged in a V formation. In front of them, pits and sharpened stakes were prepared to impede horses. Edward's men were exhausted from the march, but they had time to rest and ready their weapons. The French, eager and disorganized after a long pursuit, did not wait to coordinate. Pride demanded an immediate attack. As the first waves of French crossbowmen advanced, the English archers loosed their first arrows. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The longbow's range and rate of fire dwarfed that of the crossbows. Within minutes, the French vanguard disintegrated under volleys that darkened the sky. Horses screamed, men fell, and confusion rippled through the ranks. The French knights behind them, impatient and insulted by the retreat of the crossbowmen, charged forward without orders. What followed was chaos. The rain-soaked ground turned to mud under the pounding of hooves. Arrows fell in continuous arcs, finding gaps in armor, piercing through joints and visors, or striking the unarmored horses. The knights, struggling to keep their formation, found themselves trapped in a deadly funnel. The closer they got, the worse it became. The English archers fired up to 10 arrows a minute, their rhythm as steady as drummers in battle. The sound of arrows slicing air blended with the metallic clang of armor and the cries of falling men. Horses reared, riders were thrown, and the momentum of the charge dissolved before it even reached the English line. When the few surviving knights finally stumbled into close combat, the English men-at-arms finished what the archers had started. It wasn't just a defeat. It was annihilation. Thousands of French nobles and knights were slain, including the King of Bohemia, the Count of Flanders, and many of France's most decorated warriors. The English suffered minimal losses. The myth of knightly invincibility was shattered in a single afternoon. And yet, what truly made Crécy revolutionary was not just the bloodshed, but what it revealed. Technology, training, and terrain could overcome class and courage. The French knights had courage in abundance. What they lacked was adaptation. The English archers had turned preparation into power, and the result would echo across Europe for generations. In the aftermath of Crécy, something deeper than a military defeat unfolded, a cultural reckoning. For centuries, chivalry had been the moral and political code that structured European society. Nobles fought because they were born to. Peasants served because they were born to. But the fields of Crécy whispered a new truth. Destiny could be undone by discipline. The longbow did not care for bloodlines. It made a farmer the equal of a lord. Reports of the battle spread quickly through Europe. Chroniclers wrote of how French pride was humbled, of how the flower of French nobility lay dead in the mud. What stung the most was not the loss itself, but the manner of it. The knights had not fallen to other knights in noble combat. They had been brought down by peasants firing from a distance, men whose names would never be recorded. The romantic image of the shining cavalier charging fearlessly into glory was replaced by something grim and pragmatic. Lines of disciplined archers executing mechanical efficiency. Warfare had become less about honor and more about results. The psychological shift was enormous. Feudal lords began to realize that their wealth could no longer guarantee battlefield dominance. The cost of maintaining heavy cavalry, armor, horses, retainers, was immense, and now its effectiveness was questionable. Meanwhile, England's investment in archery proved economical and powerful. The English crown mandated archery practice, ensuring every village contributed to a reservoir of trained bowmen. War, for the first time in Europe, became professionalized. It depended less on noble courage and more on organized skill. This was also the birth of the modern military mindset, a recognition that logistics, training, and technology outweighed class and charisma. The feudal chain that had defined medieval life began to loosen. The same social forces that empowered archers on the battlefield would, centuries later, empower commoners in politics and society. Crécy was not just a military victory. It was a social revolution disguised as a battle. And this change did not end there. The lesson of Crécy was soon repeated at Poitiers in 1356 and later at Agincourt in 1415. Each time, French knights repeated the same tragic error, charging uphill into a storm of English arrows. Each time, they were cut down. The longbow became a symbol of English identity, not just as a weapon of war, but as an emblem of common defiance against aristocratic arrogance. By the time of Agincourt, Henry V's army, vastly outnumbered, would again use longbowmen to annihilate the cream of French chivalry. The knight was not just defeated, he was rendered irrelevant. The destruction of knightly power did not end with Crécy. It evolved. The principles that had made the longbow effective, range, rate of fire, and disciplined coordination, would pave the way for even more transformative weapons. Within a century, gunpowder would enter the European battlefield, and the lesson learned at Crécy would be applied with deadly efficiency. The arquebus and cannon were crude at first, but they shared the same democratic quality as the longbow. They made courage and status secondary to skill and logistics. The knight's armor, once a symbol of invulnerability, became a burden. Heavy plate that could deflect an arrow could not withstand a lead bullet. The age of armor gave way to the age of fire. But even as gunpowder spread, the legend of the English archers endured. They had demonstrated something timeless, that technology in the hands of disciplined commoners could overturn hierarchies older than memory. The rain of arrows at Crécy had not only broken French knights, it had rewritten the future of warfare. No longer would war be the private sport of nobles. It became the business of nations, of organized armies, of trained men bound not by bloodline, but by skill. And so, the story comes full circle. The arrogance that once believed metal and lineage could rule the battlefield was humbled by wood and sinew. The knight, who had ruled for centuries, found himself powerless against a farmer with a bow. Crécy was more than a battle. It was the symbolic death of an era. The twilight of chivalry, the dawn of strategy, and the first tremor of a world that would no longer bow to the old order. The connection between the past and future of warfare lies in that single afternoon. It was there that the ideals of feudal honor met the cold precision of organized power. The English archers stood shoulder to shoulder, not for glory but for discipline, not for bloodline but for duty. And when their arrows blotted out the sun, they also blotted out the myth of invincibility. The battlefield of Crécy marked the moment when history turned its gaze from the few to the many, from the shining knight to the common soldier, and never looked back.